Hey, bienvenido acá a tu Kawin Cowork, que estamos aquí en Nueva Costanera 3337, en la Casa Alta. Nuevo espacio que se está abriendo y como tal también tenemos un ciclo de meetup que partimos hace un tiempo atrás y este es uno muy especial, sobre todo porque hablamos de blockchain, hablamos de justamente supply chain. Tenemos acá a Dragos Andrea a Dragos Risesco y a Kishore Andrea, que son los co-founders de Viant, una de las grandes soluciones que tiene dentro del marco de colicencia. Así que sin más introducciones, por favor, le damos la entrega a Kishore.
Hola, very happy to be here and very excited to talk about Consensus, Viant, and what we are doing in the supply chain space. So, quick introduction about myself. My blockchain journey started about 3 years ago when I used to work for a consulting company, Deloitte, and we were really looking to kind of help a client build a blockchain-based solution. So, at that point in time, there was barely anything. So, this is, think 2015, right? Even before Ethereum had their mainnet launch, and we were investigating how blockchain can be used for loyalty applications. And that's when I got in touch with Consensus in order to figure out what we can do with blockchain. And any of you, I mean, if you have started into blockchain, you would realize that it's like a bug. Once it bites you, it's like, wow, it's a profound change that it can really bring to the table. So I was one of those that was bitten by the bug, and I joined Consensus right after, and the journey has been then on. So about me, I mean, I spent about a year and a half. I founded the Consensus Solutions business, and the whole idea was to kind of help companies, individuals, NGOs, corporates, I mean, all kind of entities to build blockchain applications. So we built quite a few bespoke, which is custom blockchain applications during that year and a half journey. And then based on those experiences, I co-founded Viant. So that's my quick journey post-blockchain, but much before that, spent about 20 years in banking, technology, and management consulting. So again, thanks for having me here, and let's spend a few minutes talking about what we're going to do in the next maybe 30, 40 minutes. The idea is to give you some quick overview of what Consensus is and what we do in this ecosystem, and also talk a bit about how did we even get here? What is blockchain? I mean, how did we get to this place in the technology journey, right? And then what does blockchain 1.0 look like, and where we are with blockchain 2.0, and then start talking about a few use cases and dive into Viant when I will have one of my co-founders, Dragos Risesco, talk about the platform and what we are doing with Viant and some of the use cases. So with that said, at Consensus we have this big vision where we think that we can decentralize this world, and we also think that removing friction from many things is possible only when you build the tools, the technologies for governance, tools and technologies for self-management and execution. So with that vision, I mean, we have about 1,100 people now. It's a very, I would say, unusually sized startup, massive in its size, 1,100 plus, spread about 25, 26 countries. And we have all kinds of people. We have like data scientists, blockchain experts. We have business development people. So all variety of talent, people working at the protocol level, people working on applications, platforms, tools, and core components. So fairly a large footprint. And this has been built over the last, I would say, 3.5, 4 years since the genesis in 2014. Consensus operates under 4 pillars for the most part. I mean, the focus is you can see that solutions is all about working with NGOs, enterprises, corporations, and governments to build solutions and ventures. So we team with other companies and build new entities, new companies, and also build bespoke solutions. Labs is a very interesting, I don't know how many of you have heard of venture production studio. So Labs is about incubating companies. So we incubate right now close to 50 companies within the Labs portfolio. So what we do there is take each of these individual companies, provide the resources, provide the technology, and grow that company into in its own entity and roll off or become what it is. So Viant is one of those portfolio companies, and what we really focus on is building supply chains of the future. Academy is primarily about educating universities, students, entrepreneurs, executives, legal professionals, and others to get up to speed on blockchain. So the idea is that if you want to build an ecosystem, you need to educate the people about what this technology can do. And academy is that pillar on which Viant delivers it to the rest of the world. Capital is primarily geared towards making investments and in adjacencies around blockchain. So if you have other companies working on blockchain, we make similar investments on those companies, as well as do things like adjacent technologies. So if somebody is building an IoT technology that can use blockchain, then capital is that arm that makes those type of investments. So how did we get here? I mean, is this an accident, or is it, is it a natural progression of technology, or is it, how did blockchain happen in the first place, right? So a quick view. I mean, I took this in 3 lenses. One is compute, the other is data, and the third is value. So if you think about any technology, I mean, these are the 3 things that generally play in, that either it's radically transforming computation, like for example, mobile phones have become almost computers in your palm, and it's an exponential technology. And similarly, how blockchain is arriving at that point through compute, data, and value. So in terms of compute, I mean, a very simple illustration here is, what problem does blockchain really solve? And that's one of the key questions that keeps coming up in many conversations. What does blockchain do? I can do this in a centralized database. I can do this through other forms. But the crux of the blockchain here is it solves the problem of trust. You don't need a third-party institution providing the trust element, and that's what computationally blockchain provides. So if you look at this progression left to right, I mean, data is recordable, and that's what we did with mainframes. And then we started putting data in silos through databases, and with the advent of internet, data became available across the network. But today we hear a lot about, is this data valid? When I go do a Google search and say about anything, is this the right information or is it the wrong information? Just because it's there, you cannot consume it. You're not able to trust the data. So what really blockchain does is give you this ability to trust the data that you're looking at. So I think it's a logical progression, but a significant progression. So if you look at this time lapse, right? I mean, you're talking from 50s to today, and this is what we see as the future, and this is how we see trust becoming a core component and in this progression. So take the eyes of compute, and let's start looking at data, right? So here, again, I mean, in a similar analogy, early on we were building on Oracle and other SQL databases, right? And that is the silo end of systems, which helped a certain purpose and value, and I think it will continue to, because I'm not thinking that any of these systems are going to completely be removed. I think they will coexist with blockchain technology, but blockchain technology will add significant value to this whole ecosystem through solving the trust problem which we have today, and we rely on third parties and institutions. So the internet made it possible for information to be globally available through whether it's social or search engines and things like that, but it's still controlled by central entities. So what you see on a search result or what you see on a social page is driven by a certain organization. And with blockchain, the trust is kind of distributed, and that's what the network really brings to bear. So as any entrepreneur, you're wondering, I mean, from a compute perspective, from a data perspective, it's a good progression, but what does it mean from a value standpoint? What value does it really bring? So again, illustratively, early on, if you were selling software, if you sold 10 software, then you made 10x value or created 10x value, because that's the number of things you produce. But then we have seen in the last 5 to 10 years emergence of n-sided or multi-sided markets. So Uber and Airbnb are great examples where you sometimes rent your house or sometimes you are renting somebody else's house. So you participate in both sides of the transactions, or have the option to participate. So we are seeing this emergence of 2-3-sided marketplace, but still the market itself is controlled by a central entity. So it's not truly sharing economy. It's the beginning, the genesis of a sharing economy. And what blockchain really does is create these n-sided markets, which means you can participate in multiple forms and doesn't have to be controlled by a central organization. So the value distribution happens far more equitably than the way it has been happening before, which I think is, again, a logical progression of how economy is growing in software. So quick show of hands, how many of you know what a blockchain is before I, maybe this is worth it, maybe it's not, but I can quickly breeze through it. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through this really quick. So this is a fairly simple slide, as you can see, right? You have two parties, Alice and Bob. I mean, if you have been in cryptography long enough, there is always Alice and Bob. And then there are people who are intercepting the transaction, changing transactions. But what problem did Bitcoin, which I call blockchain 1.0, solve is it solved the double spend problem, right? Which means in digital, right, unlike physical, there is not a distinction between original and duplicate. If I send you a file, for example, what you have is a copy of the file, and what I have is a copy of the file. Which of those two are the originals? Neither of those. Both are copies of the same digital file. Whereas in the physical realm, when you think about physical cash, when I give you money, you can look at it and say, this is the original. If somebody took a photocopy of it, even a color copy, you will know it's not the original. So that distinction was not possible till we got into this trust framework where we could say, if you have a dollar, a peso, or whatever, you could only spend it once. The network was able to prove that it can be only spent once. So that's the double spend problem, right? The other problem that also solved was irrefutably proving. So if I gave you $10, right, and you deny, oh, you never gave me those $10, how do you prove it? So that's where it solved the massive reconciliation. Constantly in any financial system, you'll find that reconciliation is a significant portion of the business. Banks will tell you that we are 70% reconciliation agency and 30% banking. So that's the extent reconciliation occupies space in any industry. So it solved the reconciliation problem because once I send you money or when it's a peer-to-peer interaction, it's provable. There is no reconciliation involved. A good example is in the real world, when you go to a store, you buy something, right? And then you give whatever the price of the item to the store. You're not reconciling. The transaction is the reconciliation. The fact that they gave you the goods, the fact that you gave them money is basically the transactions. That's the reconciliation. And that's precisely what this brings us to, right? So blockchain 1.0 solved those two key issues and allowed money to move back and forth without need of intermediaries. And beyond the money aspect, I see that as movement of data, right? If one goes from A to B, I see that movement of data. But with Ethereum and blockchain 2.0, what really started happening is this trust machine not only allowed movement of data, it also allowed logic to be executed consistently. So if there are, let's say, 5 people and we all agree on a logic, you can entrust the trust machine to execute that logic and that everybody can see. So it started creating this notion of programmable money. So what I mean by programmable money is instead of just me sending you money, I can put if then else logic and say, if these conditions are met, then money movement can happen, right? So we see this in day to day today. And I think many of us experience this, and this is a very cute example that I use often. So let's say Alice is, I'm sure it's Alice, yeah. If Alice is traveling from point A to point B, let's say she's going to fly from, say, Santiago to Rio or something, and she wants to buy flight insurance. Okay, my flight is delayed by 5 hours. I want to get 1.5 times my insurance premium. If my flight is cancelled, I want to get 1.5 times the premium. So this facility exists in the real world today, right? Nothing new about it. But here is the subtle distinction, right? Where does this logic really execute? It executes on the insurance company's systems in their rule engines. Oftentimes, you would have experienced that when you call to make the claim, oh, it's not really 5 hours. Your flight was moved to the next day, so it's not necessarily a cancellation. So there's a lot of new logic you really start hearing when you go to make the claim. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that insurance companies are deceptive. What I'm trying to suggest is you don't have transparency into the logic in that detail. And what blockchain again brings to bear is allows this logic to be in a transparent trust environment so that you can see it and you know exactly how you're going to get paid. And you don't have to make that phone call because what it really does is moves the money, because we spoke about blockchain 1.0, money transfer can happen under this logic, right? So this logic is basically your programmable money. So that's the shift that Ethereum really brought to bear. So it took the conversation purely from cryptocurrencies to programmable logic that can be executed in a trust environment. So the profound shift is now companies can use this for many of their applications or their network of applications and not just have to be on the cryptocurrency side of things. So that's what blockchain 2.0 really did to blockchain. So what is a blockchain? I see this as a culmination of many things. There is nothing net new that's really coming in here, but it's a culmination of many things. So for example, cryptographically secure, right? cryptography has existed long enough. I mean, public key, private key infrastructure has existed for almost 30 plus years. I mean, we have been using it. And if you think about distributed databases, they have existed long enough as well. So neither of these are necessarily net new technologies. At the same time, what we've really done here is an append-only ledger. So which means it's like a stack of paper, right? You can only add to the top. You cannot take something from the bottom, because if you took something from the bottom, the pile is going to fall. So it provides you a very highly verifiable history of things, and that's what the append-only ledger is, and we've already spoken about smart contracts. So I just put this thing from The Economist, which said, basically blockchain is a trust machine. I mean, that's what they said in, I think, early 2015. It gives you that mechanism and compute in data and value so that you have trustable logic, trustable money in the system. I'm going to skip this slide. I mean, the reasons for blockchain are no different than any technology investment, right? I mean, you're really trying to reduce your expenses, create new business opportunities, I mean, remove risk and accelerate customer experience. I mean, I'll pick one for the sake of discussion, which is the fact we spoke about reconciliation. If reconciliation goes away, transactions are near instantaneous, which means it's not like your money is going to get posted in the account next Monday, right? Money is getting posted in your account right now as and when the transaction is happening. So T+0 settlements are really, really feasible, which is basically it happens and it is there. And you're not waiting for many days for it to really show up in your infrastructure. So what do I do? So I think, so going back to my story, so I was doing a variety of consultative work, and as a consequence of those consultative work, it was very apparent to me that track and trace and transparency is a phenomenal use case to put on blockchain. So there are many use cases that we can solve on blockchain, and we solve this in the case of vaccines, in the case of land registry documents, in the case of oil samples. I mean, based on all these experiences, it was very evident that you could build something that is highly repeatable, and a platform of that nature can be applied in many different industries for many different types of assets. So if you think about what's going on globally in many geographies, in many forms and shapes, as consumers, we want better things. We want things that are provably, verifiably produced. For example, you don't want to be owning gold from conflicted regions. You don't want to be owning diamonds from conflicted regions, right? People want organically sourced goods. People want locally sourced goods. People want items that don't have chemicals or many other impurities in the things they buy. So these claims are being made today. So when you go to a store and say, I want an organic cotton t-shirt, I'm sure you'll find a label that says that. But is it provable? Is it verifiable? Or is it just a claim that you cannot prove or verify? And that's so purely from a marketplace, from a buyer standpoint, we are seeing the demand where you want to make transparency claims on your product or about your supply chain, and people want to buy that. On the seller side, I mean, many of them are very conscious in terms of sourcing their supplies locally, for example, right? And they want to prove that we are sourcing it locally. So why should we not get the credits? Why should we not get the benefits? So for them, it's about unlocking value. If you're already doing it, can I bring it to bear and show it and be paid for it? Regulators are oftentimes in a position where they're reactive today. They are coming in when things have happened, but they want to be like real time. They want to be like, we want to know what's going on rather than coming at the end of the game. So based on all these things, we started Viant as a blockchain infrastructure, primarily for supply chain transparency and building these supply chains of the future. So the problem domain goes, I think I explained this early on, where it spans many different types of assets and many different types of industries. So think about real estate. I mean, we all know in many geographies today that two people having a claim on the same land is not very unusual, right? So land tracking or land title tracking is an example of how a system like Viant can be used in order to solve that type of a problem. If you think about let's say vaccines. I mean, I use this often because it's a very good illustration of an end-sided market, because let's say an NGO wants to fund vaccines in a region. 50,000 vaccines, let's say in some part of Africa, is what I want to fund. They want to make sure that those vaccines are legitimate and not fake, and they are authentic, right? And that's one side of the insights. The other side is vaccine manufacturers. They want to make sure that their vaccines are not getting counterfeit. The second side of the insider market. The third is NGOs. So health workers are working on the field. They know each other. I mean, they are working in a community, and let's say they administer a fake vaccine without an idea, they are in trouble. So they want to make sure those vaccines are legitimate. The recipient at the end of all this, which is, let's say I want to get a vaccine, I want to be sure it's an authentic vaccine. So if you think about this as, I mean, some of the parts of the insides, I mean, you need that provenance, that vaccine was manufactured here, it was transported, and it's indeed legitimate. And that's an example of how transparency can help in an industry like healthcare for the asset class of vaccines. So what I'm going to do now is like turn this over to Dragoș Rizescu, who is one of the co-founders and has been working with me from the very genesis of Viant. And he was part of the project that built the oil sample tracking. And he's going to walk us through what this platform really does and how it's been put together. So over to you, Dragoș.
Thank you very much, Kishore. Hola, ¿cómo estás? So as Kishore mentioned, my name is Dragoș Rizescu. I'm a software developer, been with Consensus for 2.5 years. And prior to that, I worked in a digital software agency. My sort of like area expertise is on the front-end stack. I'm going to dive into the solution that Viant provides. So basically the way you need to look at this slide, on the left we have a use case that you can build on top of Viant, and on the right you have the elements that you can use in order to build your solution, right? So as you can see, this everything is asset-centric, which can basically represent a physical or digital good. And we can capture in it valuable information such as what, who, when, and where happened to that asset, basically, right? Moving to the next layer, we have the process that we wrap around the asset, right? So in our use case right here, we have a small business that basically wants to ship a package to a customer, right? The way that they perform that action and the way we register in the blockchain is through actions. That are part of the business process, right? I'm sorry about it. So on top of the on the actions, we basically then restrict them to what actors are sort of relevant to that. So in this case, the small business will be able to create the label. The front desk clerk needs to take in that label and then dispatch it towards the logistic operator, where the logistic operator takes in the challenge to sort of deliver that package to the customer. So this, again, these are the parts that you can model within Viant. And by the end of your modeling experience, you're going to have your supply chain solution, right? This is a functional stack of Viant. Viant is composed of 4 core modules. The first one is the network manager, where you basically define the organizations that are active within your network, right? So it's more intended towards a consortium administrator. Then we have the modeler, where basically you define your process, your asset, the thing that you want to track, right? Then the asset manager, where you basically define what sort of business actions can be performed by actors within the within your supply chain use case. And the last part is the tracker, where you basically interact with the idea that you've modeled. Very important thing is that how each model is basically represented. So we got modules that are on-chain and modules that are off-chain, right? So very, very important. Modeling is done off-chain, and then we deploy it on-chain. So we take the model that you create, through a click of a button, it will be deployed to a smart contract will be generated and be deployed on-chain. And then you can interact that on-chain through the tracker. Cool. So some key differentiators about Viant. You have the flexibility to configure an asset pretty fast. You can sort of reiterate over it, sort of think what are the best sort of what's the best state transition, the best business process for your use case, and then you can pretty fastly deploy it on a blockchain and then test your idea, right? It has low upfront cost and usage-based pricing. And of course, we offer an API that you can use to integrate with Viant. So basically build whatever like UI fits your specific use case. To give you like a more specific example, in the case of logistics, you are more interested to have like a map view centric, right? To basically like follow trucks or something like that. But in our use cases, maybe like a table of data is like more relevant, right? Especially when you're very interested in the data that are basically put in the system, right? So you can use the API for easy integration. So without like further ado, I would like to present to you a use case that we've done. The use case is named Bay to Plate. We've done it with Worldwide Life Foundation, which is like the panda. I'm gonna switch this off and then turn to a video that's gonna like walk you through. It's gonna tell you the story of how a tuna was caught in waters. Sourceable waters next to Fiji in the Pacific Ocean, and how it's like basically the whole lineage of the fish was basically captured on blockchain using Viant until it was served on a plate. Yep. that's any. Do you guys want to do? Like, hold on a second. Let me. It's so good. So this is Viant consensus. Kishore, wanna come here? Maybe they have some questions.
Yeah, of course.
I do have some. So basically, everybody involved in that supply chain, every stakeholder must have the app in order to track, because one thing is on the boat, I can track with the RFID, but it goes to the stock market, someone has to have something to scan with to collect that data.
Yep.
So how can you, you have to enforce them by somehow to use the application in order to work the whole chain.
Yeah, so I'm sure you know this, that as much as there is transparency on the blockchain, it's not something that is very user friendly for somebody to go read. So all we do here is just provide a user interface to go present the data. So in that sense, it can be a web page, so which means you're not having an application per se. It could be a code. I mean, in this case, it was a code. So we just used a code, and that's all we used to kind of share the provenance.
Can be photos.
Can be what?
Photos. I have a photo.
Of chain.
Chain.
Yeah, as long as it's,
photos.
you can, yeah. I mean, so as long as it's anchored on the blockchain, and all you need is the address or the code that goes onto it.
And the second one, it was how expensive is the gas in order to, if I'm doing on a real estate or tuna, that's very expensive if I want to sell a high price. But if it's just coffee,
Mhm.
to trace coffee, that's not very expensive. You have to one microload.
Yeah.
Few amount of coffee.
So we've done quite a few. I mean, so we have looked at low value assets, high value assets. So high value assets, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, so if it's a bag or a watch that you want to tag and track, it's pretty affordable because the incremental cost is not high. But if you're thinking about low value assets, the way we're thinking is you should be thinking either truckloads or so that you can track at the truckload level, not at the individual bean level or the bag level.
Container level.
So we have seen both container level as well as carton level tracking possible. So it really depends on the cost of your or the value of your asset that you're trying to track. The other thing I'm finding is, so in this case, the RFID itself was deployed in a closed loop, which means only from catch through processing, we attached the RFID. After that, we switched over to QR codes. So which means it's a one-time investment for the fishermen to kind of tag them, and they get the tag back. So it's not expensive. So I think there is far more. So I think blockchain is not that hammer that solves everything. So you have to be like, as part of your design thinking, you should think how you want to deploy IoT technology, how you're going to contain the cost of IoTs, because we are not at that point where the cost of IoTs are so low, right? It's still substantial, especially if you think about these kind of tags. It'll be far more than the value of the asset, or very close to the value of the asset.
I have a question. It might be related to the cost point. When you say you're tracking on chain, does it mean that every aspect that needs to be tracked will be written as soon as it occurs, or do you group somehow?
In this case, we just wrote it as and when they became available.
Okay.
So
each transaction on the whole the cycle.
So my thesis is, so if you looked at the in the picture, right, what we had was there are states, right? So you have to identify states of interest. You're not interested in everything in between.
Yeah.
So you're interested in certain states, like at catch is very critical, landing is critical, and then processing. So all those key states, we map them out, and that's when we write on chain. It's not like you're running transactions, because it becomes unaffordable.
Basically, it's what you need to create trust.
Yeah, so places where trust you think is going to get violated, you got to identify as part of your design thinking, and that's when
But
you
it
enforce.
doesn't have to be when the fish, in this case, changes hands. It could also be a process that is done by the same person.
Yeah.
For instance, it could be the same person who catches and then
So this is a good example,
lands
right?
it, and yeah.
So the processing, they receive, process, pack. So it's all done by the same institution.
Yeah.
So they still record it because those are all key steps that the customer is interested in or we thought was going to be critical. So there's a lot of, I think, design thinking that needs to go in. It's like a slam dunk blockchain, just go do it, right? I mean, so you want to look at the number of transactions that you want to run per asset class, what are the steps of interest, and of course, if you're going to, so this one was done on a permission chain. It was not done on the public chain. It was done on a permission chain. So if you're thinking about a public chain, then of course, gas cost starts playing in a substantial way. But I think it's not unsurmountable. It's very doable, just that you got to think about those elements while you design the system.
And have you looked into it, if it's possible to, because here what you have is a statement from someone who says he has done something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the future you can also have the GPS coordinates or something like that, but it's also information that comes from off the chain and you can verify it on the blockchain. But have you tried to incorporate some kind of proof from outside? I mean, a third party or?
So we did not do attesters. I mean, we could have done, like, for example, the government of the official here, I mean, could have, so they're attesting that it was landing. So if the time lapse between landing and catch is way too high, then you know that there is something going on in between. So this was done as a way to show how attestations can happen so that truth can be verified. And in this case, it was in a contained scope. But in a true trust building exercise, you're going to have far more attesters participating and, giving it a score so that you know it's really true or not.
And by the end of the whole supply chain, you get in the end a history view, which is basically data that you can verify and sort of like do extra validation on top of it.
No, go for it.
So now I was thinking about we are working on something not as Viant. We are looking to use something like that to trace coffee, cacao, but the end point is not just the proof; it's what we can do with the data. Thinking forward to use it on an AI solution to predict how can we improve the crops. So I don't know how can we put the data to extract to on another modeling.
Yeah, so there is, so one of the consensus projects, it's called Alethio. Alethio is primarily geared towards doing analytics on blockchain data. So I think you should definitely check them out. What they have done is they've taken, for example, how tokens get funded. So they have this massive, beautiful graph view of the flow of money geographically, as well as from where it has happened for a crowd sale or a token sale. So you are able to run analytics. Of course, you take the data in an off-chain context and do the analytics on top, but it's very doable. They have definitely made the first steps to get there.
I have a very technical, maybe boring question.
So that's for Dragos.
The format of the claims or attestations are in a proprietary format or a standard format, for example, the verifiable claims of the W3C. I think it in a context of what if I create a counterfeit company? But for example, I'm Rolex. I want to create a fake Rolex, and then I make my distribution chain and everything is verifiable, but my reputation as a company is counterfeit. And for example, I want to be, my company wants to be, rate my reputation in another context, in another data, for example. It's an honest standard or a verifiable standard exportable to other data?
So to give you like the short answer, it's you do an API request and you receive a JSON. But I would love to hear more about that because it seems like pretty interesting. We don't support something like that, but it seems pretty interesting.
So short answer is it's not on any of those standards, right?
Yeah.
It's a custom standard, but the way I think about it is like this is where one of the consensus folks, Uport, which I'm sure you know, is working on things like that, which is allowing organizations and individuals to establish identity, right? So one, you can have other social streams that can verify that identity, whether it is your website or whether it's a Twitter feed or whether it's a Facebook feed or whatever that might be, can publish that address, publish that identity, so that nobody is cheated out as an alternative organization. So I think that's the path forward. That's how we see the future in terms of using verifiable identities. You have a question or no?
So in the cut data, in the first part, you only work with RFID, you can make whatever we decide to make the input, or it's only that type of technology that you use to keep the track of
Maybe you have a tag that's a QR tag.
Yeah.
It's not needed to be on RFID.
Yeah.
a photo, whatever.
It can be
So-
whatever you want, basically.
The only
That's the thing is,
the only challenge with the photo is,
we put some code inside the photo.
yeah. So if you put a code inside the photo, then that's
Okay.
fine. Yeah, it could be that. Yeah.
We can put some ID.
Just a photo won't work. You need either some identifier that goes along with that photo.
Yeah. To identify the package or something.
With coffee and cacao, it's not a package.
Then you have to reproduce the exact hash, so which means only that photo is going to work, not any other photo the same fish will work. Right? So
You said that you used permissionized blockchain for this experience.
Yep.
What kind of blockchain was that?
it was Ethereum. It was Ethereum in
What's a private implementation
Yeah,
of
so-
with Ethereum?
so we used POA as the consensus mechanism, and it was contained to the participants basically.
It was just one installation of Geth.
Yep.
Are you hiring?
Yes. Yes, we are hiring. We are hiring for, so we are doing a variety of projects in the art industry, in consumer goods industry. So as I think Dragos was explaining, we are a cross-industry platform. So we can create transparency in any supply chain, and we are having a variety of active implementations going on. So would love to get more hands. Any Chilean, any geography is welcome. We are a very distributed team. We have 2 people in Chile working on Viant. Dragos is from Romania. I work from the US. So we are like geographically distributed. So very welcome, open to hiring.
Shout out to our team from here, Ricardo and Ruben. You got them right there. So.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I'm new to blockchain. So maybe my questions could be maybe not as usual as the others, but the fact is the Viant is like a platform that you offer like a solution that you make as a consultancy to a company and you make all the solution for, or you can actually work as a service. Like other people come, I would like to use your platform to, I don't know, to make this, and I make it.
Yeah, so we are doing, so our first version was a company's supply chain. So a company and its vendors and its suppliers. Our release, which was done about a month ago, which is our release 3 or release 0.3, is about getting multiple organizations like consortiums working and using the platform. So you could be one of the many organizations, and you could be like interchanging a process, an asset, or any of those type of things, and be able to track that. So the answer to your question is it's both. It's a company supply chain or a consortium of companies can use Viant.
So in those type of forms, you sell the solution, and the other type of forms, you make a joint venture, something like that?
We have experimenting with a few models. One is we're going to make it available for sure as a software as a service, which means you go fire away your instance and you can use it any which way you want to use it. The other one is like more hand holding, because we still think that the industry is maturing. There's a lot of questions, there's a lot of hand holding needed. So we work alongside with them. So we have an active beta program. So you sign up as a company into the beta program. So we guide you, because I think at some point we said it's no code needed, because we generate quite a bit of software which can be used to kind of build your application pretty quickly. But the moment you start getting into pilot and production, you want to have your own customization, your own UI and extensions and changes. So we operate in a software as a service model, but also allow for third parties to integrate, third parties to do services on top.
So what was more like that about the business model? So you have this white labeling solution. If we want to hide it.
Yeah, you can. Most of them, because they want to customize the solution or have their own UI, they have their own experience, which I think makes sense. But what we give them is a phenomenal starting point, right? So
we're a startup, so with the basics, we can work that out.
yeah. So I mean, we're building some of the custom UIs. I mean, it's taking less than a week to customize this. I mean, literally. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's not a big.
The time depends on the project, of course. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, very complex supply chains, I can imagine they can be long running. But if you really think about it, most of the time you're updating data. You're like, it happened or it is occurring, your asset is moving. So the interaction is fairly consistent. And the tracking is what is even more consistent because all you're trying to show is on 4 views, on a geographical view, on a historical view, on an active view. You want to show what happened in the chain. So.
And how this could be integrated maybe with the smart contract, considering that in the supply chain you have cheaper freight forwarding, transport, air freight, sea freight, and then you need a transshipment in some port, but you have a lot of actors that take different commercial transactions in the price. So in the supply chain, in this kind of point, you have also a commercial transaction. So.
Mm-hmm.
How the supply chain could be more automatically the process, the commercial process? You support that with this? You can integrate the whole process?
Yeah. So this is the vision of Viant. I mean, the way we think about supply chains is provenance is the foundation, right? Because you need to know where your asset is before you can build any economics or finance or commercial on top, right? So that's step number 1. So we're going to be building some economic layers like purchase order, invoice processing, bill of lading. I mean, all these things can happen only when you have assets defined and their legacy defined. But independent of that, let's say they don't want to wait for us to build. If you want to build your own, we have one way to do it, which is through the APIs, or we are actively working on our next release, which is going to have hooks on smart contracts. So which means you can use those hooks to kind of interact with our smart contracts.
Okay. This is it. It's going to be. Well, the guys are going to stay with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have a few bites out there, so there's going to be a lot of chatting, so we can get the questions ahead. And because of the time, we have to say goodbye, and that sucks. It is, but it is. So we thank you, Kishore, Andrea, y Dragos Risesco, right? That they are the part of the co-founders of Viant. ¿No? So let's give it Y para poder ir cerrando, también les damos la salud a todos los amigos que nos estuvieron viendo desde Kawin.io, también los que estuvieron en Descentralizados con los live que hicimos con los chicos. Recordarles nuevamente de que estamos acá en Nueva Costanera 3337, que va a ser una nueva casa de Kawin Cowork de ya la tradicional, que está en José Arrieta 85. Así que más que invitados a participar con nosotros, a hacerse parte de estos meetups, ya sea desde su casa como viniendo acá. Así que más que invitados nuevamente, y aquí nos despedimos de nuevo con un aplauso.